Over on Jaguar Gator 8, a new college football video is out. In this video, we talk about a bizarre controversy involving Nebraska and the 1975 Fiesta Bowl. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want you to imagine this scenario. You have a kicker on your team, and he's getting up there in age, and he's very clearly not good anymore, to the point where he is a liability. Now, the nice thing about the kicker position is that usually you can find a replacement on the street. There's no playbook that needs to be learned like there is with other positions. There's no making sure it's a scheme fit or a coaching fit, and there's no adjustment period. You're just kicking a football. So theoretically, in this situation, that kicker would either retire or the team would cut the kicker and sign a new player to take his spot, especially if the kicker, by his own admission, is not that good anymore and is actively costing the team games. If the kicker is really saying, "Please replace me, I can't kick anymore, I'm dead serious," the logical thing to do would be to, replace him and find someone that can actually do the job. It's not to do, well, what the Minnesota Vikings did in 1977. Because the man you've been watching this whole time is a kicker by the name of Fred Cox. And after a lengthy and incredible career with the Vikings, you could tell that his time was coming to an end, and at least in the football sense, was ready to think about the Rabbits. And yet, even despite the kicker's bizarre pleas for the Vikings to mercifully cut him, replace him, and put him out of his misery, the Vikings, for some inexplicable reason, refused to do that. And it all came to a head in a 1977 game between the Minnesota Vikings and the St. Louis Cardinals, where afterwards, we had one of the dumbest moments in Vikings history, one of the dumbest moments in the legendary Hall of Fame career of head coach Bud Grant, and one of the dumbest kicking controversies, if you can even call it that, in NFL history. Because this is the story behind Fred Cox, the 1977 Vikings, and the dumbest kicking controversy in the over 60-year history of the Minnesota Vikings franchise. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand who this kicker is, how he was doing, and how the game itself was going, to the point where everything got incredibly weird because of it. In 1962, the Minnesota Vikings had a horrible kicking game. The team hit just 44% of its field goals, which was comfortably in the bottom half of the league, and that number was heavily inflated by going 4 for 4 on kicks from inside 20 yards. Because on kicks from 20 plus yards, the Vikings were an abysmal 7 for 21, hitting just 33% of their kicks. 2 out of 3 ain't bad when it comes to meatloaf, but when it comes to the percentage of kicks that you miss from the 20 plus yard range, yeah, that's not good. So when the Vikings brought in Fred Cox to be their kicker in 1963, they were hoping that he would be able to alleviate some of their kicking woes that plagued them badly in 1962. But what are the odds of that happening, right? This is a guy that had never kicked professionally before in a game, and spent the 1962 season as a teacher at Freedom High School. Surely he can't be the answer to your problems, right? Well, what followed was an unbelievable career with the Vikings, where he kicked on opening day of the 1963 season against the San Francisco 49ers, and then kicked in every single game from then until the end of the 1976 season. The Vikings not only found their kicker, but found insane stability at kicker that teams dreamt of having, as the 1977 season that he was about to enter was going to be the 15th season of his career with the Vikings, without ever missing a single game. For some perspective, entering 1977, the last time the Vikings had a game where someone not named Fred Cox was kicking was on December 16, 1962. That was so long ago that John F. Kennedy was still the President of the United States. The Beatles had not yet released an album. The New York Mets had just finished up their first season in Major League Baseball and weren't even playing at Chase Stadium. And the iconic film Lawrence of Arabia literally just opened up that weekend. Absolutely crazy stuff. And it's not just that Cox brought roster stability for a decade and a half at the position, but he was an awfully good kicker too, to the point where by the time his career ended, he only trailed George Blanda on the all-time points list. On 3 separate occasions, in 1965, 1969, and 1970, he led the NFL in field goals made. During the 1969 season, he played a key part in guiding the Vikings to their first Super Bowl in franchise history, when he led the entire NFL with a field goal percentage of 70.3%, at a time where the league-wide average was just above 52%, and where roughly half the teams were at or below 50% when it came to accuracy. In 1970, he hit 30 field goals, which set the NFL record at the time for most field goals ever made by a kicker in a single season, and he received Pro Bowl honors for doing this. And its 3 seasons where he led the league in field goals made was notable, because it made him just one of 5 kickers in NFL history at the time to ever accomplish this feat of leading the league in this category 3 times. For those curious, the other 4 were Bob Waterfield, Jack Manders, Lou Groza, and Ward Cuff. You can learn more about Groza and just how good he was at kicking the football by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Cox was an absolute godsend for the Vikings, and was consistently one of the best kickers in football. Oh, and he also invented the Nerf football, so if you had any doubts about him being one of the greatest kickers of all time at that point in history, now you know. However, Father Time is undefeated. You can't stay on top forever. And after a down year in 1976, where his field goal percentage dipped from 76.5% to 61.3%, he was still going to be Minnesota's kicker in 1977. But it was very clear that he didn't have a whole lot left in the tank, and that it was time for the Vikings to start thinking about other options at the position going forward. Cox was 39 years old, and especially back then, unless your name was George Blanda, you just weren't playing into your 40s. You just physically couldn't do it. And the Vikings seemed like they had a replacement lined up for Cox in Rick Danmeyer, who had previously tried out for the Atlanta Falcons in 1974, and both the Minnesota Vikings and the Chicago Bears in 1976. But this time, it seemed like he was poised to take over for Cox and usher in a new era. Instead, he was placed on injured reserve, so Cox had the job for 1 more year, even though on paper, he had nothing left to give. And when I say that Cox had a down year in 1977, that is putting it incredibly mildly. Because by this point in 1977, the once great Fred Cox was quite possibly the worst kicker in all of football. Through the first 7 games of the season, he was just 5 for 10, hitting a mere 50% of his field goals along with missing 2 extra points. And it's not like these misses were from long distances. They were relatively close kicks. Things weren't getting better when in the team's most recent game against the Atlanta Falcons, he went 0 for 2, missing 2 kicks from close range badly. It was very clear that Cox wasn't that good anymore, but the Vikings needed him to be good for their Week 8 contest, which is the focus of this story. Because for this, we head to Metropolitan Stadium on the evening of November 6, 1977, where the Minnesota Vikings are hosting the St. Louis Cardinals. We're officially in the second half of the 14-game season, the last of its kind in NFL history. And as we head to this part of the year, the Vikings had a ton to play for. As things stood, the Vikings were sitting in first place in the NFC Central with a 5-2 record. However, the Bears and Lions were 2 games back, and were somewhat on their tails. If the Vikings win this game, they have a chance to blow this division open, and barring a massive choke job, be poised to win it for the 5th straight season, and the 9th time in the last 10 years. If they lost this game, then all of a sudden, the NFC Central is there for the taking again, and we might have a dogfight down the stretch. Well, this game was really bad for the Vikings. It was ugly with a capital U, because the Cardinals came into Metropolitan Stadium, dominated from the onset, and won by a final score of 27-7. And honestly, the game didn't even feel that close. As of the publication of this video, this is the last time ever that the Cardinals came into Minnesota and won. I fully admit that could age horribly within the next 36 hours. It seemed like everything that could have gone wrong for the Vikings on this day did, especially as they fell behind in a 20-0 halftime hole and a 27-0 hole near the end of the 3rd quarter. The Cardinals absolutely dominated on the ground, running the ball 51 times for 316 yards and 2 touchdowns, all while averaging a whopping 6.2 yards per carry, and all while Wayne Morris had 182 rushing yards. The Cardinals nearly doubled the Vikings' total yardage, outgaining them 459 to 237 on this day. Fran Tarkenton had a rough day under center, to the point where he even got benched later on for Tommy Kramer and got booed so loudly that he had to address the boos in the post-game press conference after the game. Tarkenton threw 3 interceptions and finished the game with a passer rating of just 42.6. It was incredibly uncharacteristic for him. Quite simply, it was one of those games where if you're a Vikings fan, you want to pretend that it never happened, because it was that bad, and felt like one of the worst games of the entire Bud Grant era. However, when it came to the main man in our story, Fred Cox, the Vikings needed him to have a good day if they were going to have any chance at winning this one and extending their lead in the NFC Central. He did not have a good day. Not at all. In fact, he might have been the worst player on the field. In the first quarter, on Minnesota's opening drive of the game, Cox was called on for a 27-yard field goal. Should be a chip shot, right? Easy way for the Vikings to get on the board and take an early lead. Get some momentum. That is, before Cox shanked it wide to the left. Not pretty by any means, but okay. Even though the Vikings haven't scored yet, we're approaching the end of the half, and with under a minute left, you're lining up for a 28-yard field goal. Time for redemption, and time for some easy points to get your team on the board for the first time today. Maybe get some momentum going into the halftime break. And he missed that one too. Not only did he miss 2 chip shots even by 1970 standards, and not only was the 39-year-old kicker now 0 for 4 on his last 4 attempts dating back to last week against the Falcons, but he was just 5 for 12 on the season, now hitting his kicks with less than 50% accuracy. Even if we go back to the end of the 1976 season the year before this, when you look at Cox's last 12 games, he was hitting less than 48% of the time. You couldn't rely on Cox anymore. Cox knew it, every Vikings fan knew it, and just about everyone in the NFL knew it. They knew that for the 39-year-old kicker, his time was coming up. And that was when things got rather bizarre. Because after the game, in light of his awful performance today, and his awful performances over the past year, Cox made a weird request in the post-game press conference. He said, "Please sign a kicker. I'm begging you. Get me out of here so I can retire. I suck." Now, he wasn't quite as blunt, as direct, or as straightforward as that, but that's exactly what he was getting across. He's not good anymore. He can't hit field goals like he used to. And if Bud Grant would just sign a replacement kicker and fill that void, he would be gone and would happily walk away and step aside. No questions asked. As Cox said, "I wouldn't be averse to giving up the job right now if Bud Grant could find a guy to help the team. Right now, I'm not doing it. It's going to be hard for us to win the last couple of months if I keep going this way. I'm not contributing anything kicking like this. I've never gone through anything like it in the 15 years I've been kicking. It's weird. Something's pretty radically wrong." I mean, let's be honest. How many times have you ever heard any players say anything along those lines before, where they're begging the front office and the coaching staff to replace him and put him out of his misery? Cox wasn't going to retire in the middle of the season and just walk away like that. He had too much pride and too much respect for everyone involved to even attempt that or think about it. But if the Vikings decided to cut him and sign a replacement, that would be ideal for him. So what did the Vikings do after this? What did they decide to do regarding the kicker position, now that not only was it very apparent that Cox couldn't do it anymore, but that he was begging the team to replace him and maybe didn't even want to do it anymore? Let's ask Neo. Nothing. What about the script? Nothing. What about the magic conch?
Nothing.
That's right. The Vikings did nothing about this whatsoever. Whether they just couldn't find a replacement, which shouldn't have been that hard seeing how bad the current guy was, or they didn't want to, is unclear. But they decided to stick with Fred Cox in what now had to be one of the dumbest kicking controversies of all time. You had a kicker who was essentially saying, "I stink. I can't kick anymore. Please let me retire." And you had a coaching staff saying, "No, We're not going to get rid of you or let you do that. Truly baffling, especially since Cox only made 3 more field goals the rest of the way over the final 6 games of the season before the Vikings finally moved on from him after the 1977 season ended. Trying to understand Minnesota's logic with this kicking controversy, especially since neither Bud Grant nor anyone in the front office directly addressed it, is enough to make your brain hurt. All Grant said was a month after the fact, when he said that other teams would have given up on him and would have tried to go with someone else by this point. Which is true, seeing as most teams wouldn't be dumb enough to keep a kicker who can't kick anymore and who is blatantly saying, "Please replace me. I stink now. The only reason I'm even here is because you haven't signed anyone else for some reason." But in 1977, that's exactly what was happening with the Minnesota Vikings. Because when you consider the absolutely bizarre circumstances behind this, from the fact that it's super easy to just find a kicker off the street, to the fact that the kicker in question wanted to walk away, and the team either didn't let him or didn't think it was a good idea, what followed after that game against the Cardinals had to be the dumbest kicking controversy in Minnesota Vikings history. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.